Let's get ready to welcome our fourth speaker of the Powerhouse Within, David MIZAN HASHIM. David MIZAN HASHIM is the founder, group president and director of the VERITAS design group, one of Asia's largest multidisciplinary design firms, which he established in 1987 and which now has offices in 6 countries and is based in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. He has won the prestigious Most Outstanding Malaysian Award from the Junior Chamber of Commerce in 1999 in the category of entrepreneurial accomplishment and led VERITAS to receive the 1999 Enterprise 50 Award for the best run medium-sized firm by Anderson Consulting. In 2005 and again in 2008, he was among the 5 finalists in the Ernst & Young Malaysian Master Entrepreneur of the Year Awards. David has been very active in the promotion of global trade in services and has spoken on the subject around the world on the behalf of International Trade Commission, the Malaysian External Trade Development Corporation, MATRIC, and the Malaysian Ministry of International Trade and Industry, MITI. He has spoken at numerous conferences, universities, and professional forums around the world, so we are extremely lucky to be able to hear from him today. So let's all tune in to his speech titled Shelter, Human Resilience in the Anthropocene.
The fact that we exist today as a species is testament to the resiliency of our ancestors, especially their ability to construct shelter. From before recorded history, early humans occupied and later constructed physical shelter to protect themselves from the ravages of nature and conflict. Though Homo sapiens were not the only animal to do so, their exceptional ability to continuously improve and modify their shelter to deal with the various types of danger specific to a place and time was key to our survival and evolution. As they migrated across the planet, our ancestors learned to build specific forms of protection in response to natural conditions prevalent in their habitat. When the dangers were tides and floods, shelter was built on stilts. Where earthquakes were common, structures were built in such a way as to withstand them. And whether it was to keep out life-threatening heat or cold, humans across the planet instinctively evolved the design and construction of their dwellings and later their cities to achieve greater health and mortality, thus improving their chances of survival. In other words, necessity as the mother of invention was the mantra for the evolution of our buildings and cities, and the resulting resiliency of our species. Many of the earliest forms of these habitations still exist today, such as Jericho in what is modern Palestine, or Damascus, the oldest continuously occupied city on Earth, founded in 8000 BC. The technologies and traditions we have learned to construct shelter to protect human lives in the face of varying environmental dangers have become increasingly improved and perfected over thousands of years of trial and error. However, there are relatively newer and increasingly serious existential threats to humanity for which we have less preparation, threats for which our long and evolving tradition of resilient design has insufficient precedent to adapt for. The current pandemic has exposed the fragility of modern urban design and architecture in the face of a truly existential threat to humanity. But we should have been better prepared. Even during the Black Plague in the Middle Ages in Europe, it was widely known that towns with less density, with more open space, parks, and ventilation would suffer fewer casualties. Wealthy urban dwellers fled their teeming villages and towns to the countryside whenever a pandemic struck. They knew that homes with better hygiene, sanitation, and air circulation would better protect their inhabitants from contagion. Yet despite this knowledge, our civilization has failed to create a built environment to better protect ourselves from contagions such as COVID-19. Now, recent scientific discoveries in exactly how infectious diseases spread have only confirmed what we already knew. To prevent viral transmission among urbanites, cities should have been more well-ventilated and sunlit public spaces, and buildings should have had greater physical separation. Shelter of any kind, whether it be residential, office, schools, or hotels, must have good natural ventilation and sunlight in their lobbies, corridors, and individual dwellings. This is because most pathogens dissipate quickly in circulating air and solar radiation. Other attributes such as spacious elevators, large rooms, and more airy interiors would also have made buildings more resilient to the spread of infectious disease. And balconies. Balconies should not have been considered luxuries at all, especially for residential buildings. Due to the deprivations of quarantine, they were always necessary to maintain a reasonable quality of life when you are locked up with your family for days or weeks at a time. Walking and cycling should be a more common means of movement, and public transportation needs to be reorganized to avoid congestion. We knew all these things, but we conveniently forgot. My point is that humanity certainly should have been more prepared for the pandemic with better urban design, environmental, and architectural solutions. But unfortunately, the pressure of space and economics conspired to prevent our constructions of shelter from embracing these life-preserving practices. The resulting hardships arising from this most recent pandemic should be a wake-up call to us all to be better prepared for a much more certain and devastating threat to humanity, which is actually just around the corner, and for which we are far less prepared. I am referring, of course, to climate change, the most significant symptom of the Anthropocene. Now, the Anthropocene, it is the unit of geological time used to describe the most recent period in Earth's history, when human activity started to have a significant and lasting impact on the planet's climate and ecosystems. Scientists date the onset of this epoch to the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s, accelerating in the mid-20th century with the advent of the atomic bomb. Unlike earlier epochs in our planet's climatic record, this is the first to be determined by humanity. Now, our civilization has not even begun to address the magnitude of the challenge that will be upon us in the Anthropocene to create safer and more livable places for the human species in a world in which weather is vastly different from what it has been since ancient history. And perhaps because these very real outcomes for planet Earth and all of us inhabitants are too overwhelming to consider, we have until now not taken the difficult steps necessary to confront them. Instead of dealing objectively and considering real solutions for the looming prospect of catastrophic seawater rise, temperature increase, and the droughts, floods, and other disasters that will certainly accompany them, we have instead distracted ourselves by tinkering with green ratings, environmental certifications, and sustainability metrics. Now, that activity may lure us into the comfort of thinking that we are effectively responding to the future danger, but it is akin to arranging the deck chairs as the Titanic sinks. Now, I don't mean to be a doomsayer, but the fact is that even in the unlikely event that humanity is able to reduce our carbon consumption to an extent that global temperature rise does not exceed the 1.5 degree Paris Accord commitment, the momentum of global warming will likely continue for centuries. This is because it takes that long for the existing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to dissipate. And assuming that this 1.5 degree mark is breached, as most scientists believe it will, the broader, long-term climatic effects on our delicate planet are indeed chilling to contemplate. Even a sea level rise of only half a meter by 2100, as predicted in most climate change models, will directly impact over 50 million people and wreak indescribable disruption to the rest of human activity. The atmosphere may become more dangerous. Storms will become more regular and more intense than we can conceive. Many parts of Earth will become uninhabitable by the standards of current urban design and building construction. Scientists also believe that pandemics will become more common in a warmer planet with a larger, denser population. It is sobering to consider that, despite knowing that another pandemic was inevitable, and having experienced them before within our lifetimes, and knowing what was necessary to confront one, we still failed miserably to implement what was necessary, such as building more resilient shelter. Humanity was unable to collectively and consistently make even the simplest of sacrifices required to mitigate the crisis, such as social distancing and wearing of masks. Similarly, I expect with deep concern for the fate of humanity that we will again fail to make the collective sacrifices required to meet global carbon emissions reductions. For the above reasons, I believe that we need to immediately start diverting some of our attention and resources away from trying to prevent global warming and climate change, a challenge we seem to be losing anyway, to actually dealing with the imminent impact of this slow brewing catastrophe. In other words, to simply start adapting for the reality that awaits us, to build for resilience. The fact is that cities throughout the world, their infrastructure and all the buildings they comprise will need to be reimagined and re-engineered in the face of climate change and the real possibility of another pandemic, to provide the shelter and protections we need for our continued well-being and survival. For example, we will need to build on higher ground in anticipation of seawater rise and away from seafronts, rivers, and deltas, or on stilts to avoid catastrophic flooding. The lower floors of existing waterfront buildings may have to be abandoned, along with the streets that surround them. We will need to construct sturdier buildings to withstand storms more destructive and regular than we have ever known, with better insulation to keep out the rising heat. We will need to design buildings with improved ventilation and air circulation to filter worsening air pollution and the increased likelihood of future pandemics. And as global climate changes take effect, migration to the cities will accelerate as people attempt to escape natural disasters and the arising food scarcity, poverty, and conflict, which will disproportionately affect the countryside. We must not continue to make the mistake of building slums and overcrowded high-rise buildings with no parks to accommodate this urban migration. Instead, we should build higher and further apart, creating public facilities and gardens in the sunlit sky. Climate change will also disrupt essential utilities such as power generation, water supply, sanitation, and telecommunications. So, we will need to build infrastructure resilience for our cities and dwellings. This means less reliance to begin with and multiple modes of essential service delivery for what we do require. For example, we must first reduce our reliance on electricity by lifestyle changes and devising more efficient equipment. And then, to produce the energy we do need, we should not rely only on one power source, but instead have redundant modes including solar, bio, wind, thermal, and even nuclear at our disposal, both at the macro and the local scale. The emerging interest in smart cities is partly a response to impending climate change. Smart cities are urban areas that use various types of electronic methods and sensors to collect data on the ways in which the areas function and uses this data to manage municipal assets, resources, and services more efficiently than otherwise. The prohibitive costs of creating these smart cities systems has hindered their full realization. However, as we begin to experience the service and resource disruptions soon to be caused by climate change, I believe that smart cities will begin to play an essential role to predict and mitigate them. For example, if heavy rains are predicted, a smart city may drain its reservoirs to prepare for potential flooding while creating and storing the resulting hydroelectric energy. And if droughts are predicted, a smart city may preempt the disruption by storing additional quantities of water and rationing supplies to its consumers. You know, I don't intend to be a scaremonger, but the early signs of impending catastrophe are too obvious for us to ignore, if not in our lifetimes, then in those of our children and grandchildren. We should, of course, continue to work toward carbon reduction and hope that our efforts result in lower climate change. But hope is not a strategy. We need to actually start physically preparing for the worst. Our cities and our buildings will need to adapt and become more resilient if our species is to survive the coming climate crisis. Ladies and gentlemen, the United Nations Independent Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, concluded in its most recent report that humans can no longer reverse some of the most catastrophic effects of climate change or stop its intensification over the next several decades. According to the UN World Meteorological Organization, there have been more than 11,000 climate change-related weather disasters since 1970, resulting in 2 million deaths and $3.64 trillion in losses. Over the last few years, this has accelerated to a daily toll of 115 deaths and $202 million in losses. We witness increasingly regular and catastrophic weather anomalies every day in the news. It is no longer a matter of control. What is left for us now is to learn to adapt to the Anthropocene. In conclusion, despite the looming dangers, there is a role each of us can play to avoid the worst-case scenarios. This ties back to the theme of this TEDx series, the Powerhouse Within. While we should all be conscious of the ways in which our lifestyle adds to the planet's carbon footprint and strive to reduce that where possible, each of us should begin to consider and plan for resilience in the face of the unstoppable and imminent disruptions that will soon accompany recurrent pandemics and, more importantly, catastrophic climate change. We must raise awareness about the dangers of not adapting and demand more resilient design of our cities and our buildings. We must advocate for policies, regulations, and laws that will eventually be needed to protect human lives. It is the responsibility of this generation to relearn the imperatives of resilience to save our planet and our human civilization. As an architect and an urban designer, I have long advocated for changes in the way our cities and buildings are conceived to become more resilient to these future threats. But one voice is not enough. I hope that those who hear this message will join me, each in our own way, to change the tide of human affairs. This should be our legacy. Thank you.